They say justice is coming, but what does it mean when justice only arrives after the blood has dried? In July 2025, the International Criminal Court made an announcement that shook Nairobi to its core. President William Ruto of Kenya was under official consideration for investigation. The charge authorizing the violent suppression of nationwide protests, leaving 70 civilians dead, hundreds wounded, and thousands grieving in silence. But instead of submitting to the court, Ruto went live on national television, not to mourn, not to explain, but to mock. "No foreign court will ever judge me," he declared. Yet just days later, from the red soil of Burkina Faso, another voice rose. A soldier, not a showman. A leader without wealth, but with something far more dangerous, a conscience. His name was Traoré. And unlike Ruto, he wasn't running from judgment. He was building a new one. You're watching Spirit of Africa. If justice must speak our language, then let us speak it together. Subscribe and let's walk this road with eyes wide open. The streets of Kenya did not fall silent. They screamed. In June 2025, what began as protests against a brutal finance bill became a nationwide reckoning. Fuel, bread, internet taxed, even diapers. For a people already crushed under inflation, it felt like a final insult. And so they rose. Not in anger alone, but in pain. Students, mothers, elders, the jobless, and the hopeful, they marched. From Kisumu to Mombasa, from Eldoret to Nairobi. Their chants, Haki Yetu, our rights. But the answer was not reform. It was repression. Live ammunition fired into crowds. Children screaming beside unconscious mothers. Women dragged into vans without charge. By early July 70, were dead. Over 500 wounded, 532 arrested. The ICC took notice, issuing a preliminary statement of concern. But for many Kenyans that meant nothing. "Why did they wait until we buried our sons?" a mother in Mathare asked. On corrugated metal graffiti began to appear, "The court watches. The people bleed." Because this is no longer just about a budget. This is about a state that has turned its guns inward and a man who believes he cannot be judged. And so we ask, what happens when democracy begins to kill? In 2013, William Ruto stood before the International Criminal Court as a man accused of orchestrating post-election violence that left over 1,000 people dead and displaced more than 600,000. He did not stand as a dictator. He stood as a deputy president, a symbol many believed of progress, modernity, and democratic transition. For some in Kenya, this trial marked a painful reckoning. For others, it was a chance to reclaim dignity after decades of impunity. But justice faltered. Key witnesses vanished. Others recanted under mysterious circumstances. Civil society groups reported intimidation. The prosecution itself admitted to obstruction. And in the end, the case, like so many against powerful men, collapsed under the weight of silence and sabotage. Ruto walked free. But what walked beside him was not innocence. It was a precedent. Because when power escapes judgment, once it does not reflect, it calculates. In the years that followed, Kenya did not erupt into chaos. It sank into something quieter and more dangerous: order without conscience, control without compassion, democracy without soul. Under Ruto's leadership, the mask of freedom stayed on, but the eyes behind it no longer blinked. Journalists who questioned were harassed. Newspapers that exposed corruption were threatened. Student unions that organized were infiltrated. Dissent was no longer debated. It was tracked, flagged, and removed. In 2022, journalists at Nation Media faced cyber attacks after airing exposés on police brutality. In 2024, university students were detained without charge after staging peaceful sit-ins. And by 2025, such violations had become routine, no longer shocking, no longer news. This was not the collapse of democracy, it was its imitation. And for many Kenyans, it was the cruelest betrayal of all. When the finance bill was introduced in June 2025, it wasn't just another policy. It was a spark thrown onto a field soaked in fuel. The bill proposed new taxes on fuel, bread, internet access, even diapers. For ordinary Kenyans, it wasn't just unjust, it was insulting. It told the poor, "You will pay for our failures." And so they rose. Not with weapons, but with placards, with voices, with chants that reached every corner of the republic. From the highlands of Kisumu to the streets of Mombasa, from the slums of Mathare to the coastal villages of Lamu they came. Young and old, mothers with children on their backs, students with nothing but hope in their pockets. Vendors, teachers, nurses, the unemployed. They chanted Haki Yetu, our rights. They said, Hatupangwingwi, you won't dictate to us. But what met them was not dialogue, it was force. Tear gas, batons, armored trucks, and then live bullets. In Cabera, a child was seen crying beside her unconscious mother. In Milongo, women were dragged into military vehicles screaming. In Tom Mboya Street, a video went viral, a young boy barely 16 shot while trying to run from police fire. He was carrying a loaf of bread. By July 10, the numbers were grim. 70 confirmed dead. Over 500 injured. 532 arrested, many held without formal charges. And still no apology, no resignation, no accountability. Instead, on July 4th, Independence Day, the President of Kenya took to the airwaves. He stood in State House Nairobi flanked by generals in full uniform and ministers who said nothing. And looking straight into the camera with the national flag behind him, Ruto declared, "No foreign court will ever judge me. No sorrow, no shame. Just contempt dressed as sovereignty." In Eldoret, once Ruto's stronghold, graffiti appeared on government walls. He was our son, but not our voice. In Umoja, a working-class estate residence held candlelight vigils. Photos of victims were laid on the ground. Some candles flickered beside empty school bags. A woman held a sign that read, "If the ICC is silent, we are already dead." The silence from international bodies was deafening. Yes, statements came grave concern, deep worry, preliminary investigations. But the people didn't want words. They wanted judgment. And they knew from history that it might never come. Because this was not the first time Kenya had cried. And not the first time no one listened. So the people turned inward. Poets held readings in alleyways. Artists painted murals of resistance. Youth groups formed community patrols. In Nairobi's Uhuru Park, a wall of names began to rise, a memorial to those democracy had swallowed. It was no longer just a protest. It was a reckoning. The mask had fallen, and what stared back was not democracy. It was its shadow, and still Ruto stood untouched. So we ask again, what happens when democracy begins to kill, when ballots give birth to bullets, when leaders elected to serve become masters who punish, when justice is no longer blind but turns its head? If you believe justice should not arrive after funerals, but before the first scream, write Amen in the comments. For every family still waiting, for every name on that wall, because this is not just about Kenya. This is about every African who voted with hope and received silence in return. Every protester who believed democracy meant more than just a ballot. Every elder who fought for independence only to see their children gunned down by those wearing the same flag. And while the world hesitated, issuing cautious press releases and empty condemnations, one voice from the dry Sahel rose louder than all the rest. A man in uniform, not standing in a courtroom, but standing before his people unafraid. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of something far more radical: justice, real justice, written by African hands, spoken in African tongues, rooted in African soil. His name, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And what he said next would rattle everything the old world thought was unshakable. The cameras were rolling, the room was full, and the world wasn't paying attention. It was just another summit, they thought, just another African conference filled with statements, handshakes, and delays. But then he stood up, no translator, no teleprompter, no hesitation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso took the stage, not as a diplomat, not as a politician, but as something far more dangerous to the old order, a soldier with a moral compass. His voice did not tremble. It struck. "This is not about protecting leaders," he began. "It is about protecting the people." The hall fell silent. Delegates from Mali, Niger, Congo, South Sudan leaned forward. He spoke not with legalese, but with fire. Not with fear, but with fury. And behind every word was the weight of generations betrayed. For too long, he said, we have waited for justice, written in foreign languages. We have buried our dead while Western courts deliberated. We have sent evidence across oceans and received silence in return. But how many more must be buried before truth matters more than treaties? It was not a speech, it was a reckoning. And then the moment that changed everything. We will build our own court, he declared, a people's African court. Not to defend regimes, but to deliver justice where the global system has failed. For a split second, even the cameras blinked. Delegates looked to each other. Was he serious? Yes, deadly serious. And with those words, Traoré did something African leaders had not dared to do in generations. He didn't ask for justice. He declared it. The court, he explained, would rest on three pillars. It would prosecute governments and military regimes that authorize violence against peaceful protesters, regardless of alliances, foreign ties, or economic stature. It would hold multinational corporations accountable, especially those that extract African resources while polluting lands, underpaying workers, and funding instability. It would investigate covert foreign interventions, be they military, financial, or digital, that destabilize African nations under the guise of aid or trade. And then came the line that struck deepest. If Africa must kneel before justice, he said, let it be justice built by African hands in African languages on African soil. The room erupted. Some clapped, some wept, and others, mostly those wearing expensive suits and foreign ties, looked down. Because they knew what had just happened. The monopoly of moral authority had been broken. For decades, African leaders were judged always in courts they did not build by judges they did not choose in legal frameworks written without their voice. Even when guilt was real, the process was foreign. Even when justice was needed, the system was political. And now a soldier from a country they once called poor, unstable, dependent, had just turned the tables. He had spoken a new language, the language of sovereign justice. From Ghana to Cameroon, the speech went viral within hours. Radio hosts called it Africa's Nuremberg moment. Legal scholars held emergency forums. Protest leaders in Senegal and Togo called it the beginning of a justice uprising. In South Africa, a retired judge whispered on a live interview, "We have waited 100 years for someone to say this. If you believe justice should speak the language of the people, not the donors, say Amen in the comments. Because this isn't just a speech. This is a call to build something. Our ancestors never had a courtroom that knows our names, our wounds, and our truths." Back in Ouagadougou, the vision became blueprint. A 14-hectare site was designated just outside the capital on ancestral land where elders once settled disputes under trees, not in marble halls. The court would be constructed using red earth stone drawn from Mossi and Dou tradition. It would face east to greet the morning sun, symbolizing transparency, rebirth, and truth. And most radical of all judges would not be appointed by heads of state. They would be selected by a continental council made up of civil society groups, legal scholars, human rights defenders, and most importantly, representatives of victims' families. No ties to governments, no funding from foreign lobbies, no immunity for those in power, because Traoré understood something others forgot. If justice must be born again in Africa, the first thing we must exile is fear. And suddenly the West began to notice. Diplomats called it symbolic. NGOs called it unrealistic. And yet in their voices was something they rarely showed: worry. Because they understood if Africa stopped asking for justice and started delivering it, the entire architecture of international control would begin to crack. And maybe that was the point. This wasn't just about courts. It was about courage. Traoré didn't stand to protect himself. He stood to protect the victims Ruto had trampled. The children shot in the streets of Nairobi. The mothers left holding only funeral programs. The workers who bled for corporations that paid them pennies. And that is why he is feared, because he is not looking for justice from the old world. He is building it from the ground up with his hands, with his voice, and with a generation behind him. The dust had barely settled in Ouagadougou, but the echoes were already spreading. From Kinshasa to Accra, from Asmara to Bamako, the question was no longer whether Traoré was serious. It was whether Africa was ready. In Mali, the Prime Minister declared the proposal a historic step toward true sovereignty. In Eritrea, the state-run broadcaster hailed it as long overdue. In the DRC, the government issued a formal endorsement calling it an answer to centuries of external interference. And in Ghana, something even more powerful happened. The Independent Bar Association, not the government, released a statement read aloud on national television. "This is Africa's Nuremberg, if we are brave enough." Those words landed like thunder, because they carried not just aspiration, but warning. The Nuremberg trials, after all, were not simply a courtroom. They were a reckoning, a line drawn through history that said, "No more, not in our name." But who in today's Africa dares to draw such a line, not through Europe's crimes, but through Africa's own wounds? Who dares to put a sitting president on trial while he still holds power? Who dares to call injustice by its real name when it wears the same uniform as your brother? In Senegal, a young activist wrote on X, "We are the first generation to inherit not freedom, but excuses." In Cameroon, students debated, how do we build a court that will not collapse under pressure? How do we write laws when the ink is soaked in betrayal? In Nigeria, a retired judge asked, can justice grow where fear is still in bloom? And that right there was the center of the storm. Because for all the applause and celebration, there was a shadow that walked beside the dream. A shadow made of history, of coups dressed as reforms, of slogans that sounded like freedom but hid another kind of cage. And in the Western capitals, that shadow was already being used as a weapon. Foreign media called Traoré's plan symbolic theater. Some European diplomats dismissed it as populist posturing. Others worried it might be used for vendettas. But underneath their words was something more primal fear, not of the court, but of its possibility. Fear that if this model succeeds, it will challenge more than just leaders. It will challenge the very architecture of control. Because if Africa can write its own legal definitions of sovereignty, responsibility, and truth, then it no longer needs permission. It no longer needs Geneva. It no longer needs to explain its pain in someone else's language. And that is terrifying, not because it is wrong, but because it is powerful. Still, even among Africa's own children, the doubt was real. One law student in Kenya asked, what will happen when the first indictment targets someone still in power? Will the court still move forward? Or will it hesitate, like The Hague always did? Another in Uganda asked, who will fund this court when donors demand conditions? Who will protect its judges when the powerful feel threatened? And in Addis Ababa, a scholar said, to dream of justice is noble, but to deliver it, that takes more than law. It takes loyalty to truth over tribe, and that is rare. So the continent found itself at a crossroads, not between Traoré and Ruto, but between memory and motion. Between what Africa had been told it could not do and what it now dared to attempt. In Ouagadougou, the dream began to take shape. Blueprints were drawn. Land was cleared. Stone was chosen. The People's African Court would not be built in glass towers. It would rise from red soil carved in the shapes of Mosi and Dune tradition. The courtroom would face east to greet the sun, a symbol of judgment in the open light. No shadows, no secrets. Most radical of all judges would not be selected by governments. They would be chosen by a continental council of scholars, activists, and victims' families. And before any case could begin, it would pass through a Truth Commission regional hearings that give voice to the voiceless, not just evidence to prosecutors. Justice must be a conversation, said one commissioner from Ghana, not a transaction between the powerful. But the road ahead remains brutal. What happens when a president refuses to appear? What happens when a multinational threatens to pull investment unless their crimes are ignored? What happens when military allies of foreign nations stand trial and their backers turn hostile? What happens when the court must decide between justice and survival? Because the truth is this: building a courtroom is easy. Building courage that takes a generation. And yet, something is shifting. For decades, African pain was data in a foreign report. Testimonies translated, names mispronounced, evidence reviewed while bodies were buried. Now for the first time there is a chance, a real one, to speak justice in the language of the wounded. To let a mother in Kibera face the man who ordered the guns. To let a miner in Mali name the company that poisoned his water. To let a child in South Sudan say, "I am not collateral damage. I am a witness." And maybe that is why Traoré's voice struck like lightning. Because he was not speaking as a president. He was speaking as a son, a brother, a man who had seen his people beg for justice at doors that never opened, and now he is building a door of his own. The question is not whether the world will walk through it. The question is whether Africa will dare to knock. He stood behind a podium, again, this time not in sorrow, not in silence, but in arrogance. President William Ruto, flanked by military officials, national flags draped behind him, looked straight into the camera and said, "No foreign court will ever judge me." His voice did not tremble. It thundered with defiance, not the kind that defends a people, the kind that shields a throne. But what does it say when a man fears not guilt but exposure? When a leader speaks not to unify the wounded but to warn the watchers, he called it sovereignty. But the people knew better, because real sovereignty doesn't hide behind rifles. It doesn't trample the grieving, silence the press, or jail teenagers holding bread and hope. Real sovereignty isn't allergic to justice, it demands it. And yet Ruto wasn't alone in that room. He had generals, he had ministers, he had power, but not presence, because presence, real presence, was rising from another place. In Ouagadougou, Traoré was not behind glass or marble. He stood on red earth, among farmers, students, survivors. He didn't wrap himself in the flag to escape judgment. He laid the flag down and invited judgment to begin. One man builds a courtroom with doors wide open. The other builds walls thicker, taller, colder. One says, "Come, let the victim speak." The other says, "Stay silent or face the gun." And in this contrast, a continent must choose who truly serves the people, the one who calls for justice, or the one who runs from it, because power is not proven in how long a man stays in office. It is proven in whether he's willing to stand accountable when the people knock. So here we are. One man clings to the title president as if it were a shield against truth, and the other, he walks into the fire not to burn others, but to light the way. This is no longer a battle between two men, it's a question written across the soil of a continent. Will Africa judge its own, not with vengeance, not with violence, but with clarity, courage, and conviction? Because justice has never truly arrived on this continent by plane. It has never worn suits or spoken the language of donors. It has always come late, if it came at all, and yet here we are, on the edge of something different. Not perfect, not polished, but real. In Nairobi, mothers still sit beside empty beds. In Ouagadougou, builders lay the first stones of a courtroom that did not exist before. Two images, one of silence, one of promise, and the world is watching. Some hope the African People's Court will collapse, that it will falter under pressure, fragment under politics, vanish like so many other dreams. But here's the truth. This court was never built to impress the powerful. It was built to answer the forgotten. The child shot for chanting, the miner poisoned for profit, the mother who never received a name, only a number on a list. And for them, for us, the question is no longer, can Africa deliver justice? It's, will we dare to protect it when it begins to speak? Because justice is not just a gavel, it's a decision. To remember instead of forget, to act instead of wait, to judge not with the eyes of empire, but with the eyes of the people. And if this dream breaks, let it break because we tried, not because we doubted. Let the world say what it will, but let history record that in the year 2025, when the blood of the innocent called out once more, Burkina Faso didn't whisper, it thundered. And Kenya, even in its silence, helped awaken something far larger than a protest. It awakened a generation. If this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Write Africa Rise in the comments. Let the world see what unity looks like when we speak with one voice. Subscribe to Spirit of Africa, because justice isn't just a courtroom, it's a movement, and it begins with us.